we have a couple things to talk about today. I would like to discuss with you, I'd like to visit China just one last time briefly, to go to Xi'an to talk about the terracotta warriors, which are a mold made process. And then I would like to take you to 2 factories in Europe that we visited with some student groups, one in Berlin and one in the Netherlands. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about making a one-piece mold. So I have some demo materials here set up to talk about that. Yeah, so we're good. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll take a break between the spots. But what you're looking at, I think right now on your screen share is the city wall of Xi'an, which is a town in northwestern China, I'll say. And it has a huge city wall around it. So I just wanted to take you to our location, and then we'll go from here. Okay, does that work? All right, yay. So the first place in Xi'an I want to take you just really briefly that's not mold made ceramics is a small village that's probably close to 6,000 years old, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the name, but I think it's called Banpo. And I just wanted to stop there really quick because, again, people make clay objects in areas where there is the natural resources. So 6,000 years ago, they were not shipping it across the country, much less across the world, to make pots. And so this is a really traditional urns from that time period. And this is all like a big archaeological site where these things have been built, dug up. So some of them are ceremonial for burial purposes, and then some of them are functional. And I wanted to show this because the one on the left is a steamer pot, and this was actually the first time I'd ever seen anything like this. So it was really fantastic to see the sort of internal compartment that would slide inside of this clay vessel, and then that would be burnt. And then the one on the right is a very traditional vessel, and you can see in the picture above it that the clay handles usually have some sort of ropes attached to them, and so they hang. And then of course this would have been pre-furniture. So that point on the bottom of it would have actually been helpful to actually stabilize it in the ground, or in sandy soil or inside of rock, so you could kind of like stabilize that point. But I really want to go to Xi'an to talk about the terracotta warriors, which is, and you've probably heard about it. There was a wonderful exhibit in Richmond just maybe 2 years ago that a few students went to with me. And this is inside of a huge structure that's been built around these enormous pits of these terracotta warriors. So this would have been the first emperor of what he would have called a unified China. And this would have been near his burial mound. And in the 70s, a farmer in the field, while he was digging, uncovered one of the warriors, and essentially kept digging from there, and with the government's help, have found thousands and thousands of warriors. In fact, there's so many of them that they haven't dug them all up because they believe that the technology for archaeology will only increase as time goes on. And these were all really highly decorated and painted. And so they think they can preserve that better under the soil until the technology gets a little bit more advanced to preserve it. So all of these warriors are life-size, and they're made in parts. And all of these parts would have been made out of molds. So there's a lot of different figure types. And if you look at each one of them, they're individual and unique. Because of maybe the combination of parts that they put together, of course, across the different types, but a lot of them might have slightly different facial features. So when the heads are coming out of the mold, perhaps they would have been slightly sculpted, they would have been wet at that time, and then they're all put together. So they're in these long pits, as if they were lining up to march. And in the solid earth that you can see between them, those are the mounds that would have had logs over the top. And so those are impressions of logs that have been, you know, decayed over so many years, but that impression is still left in the earth. And so these would have been covered and buried and hidden like his mound. So in some ways to protect it, it was dug deep into the earth. And so there are many, there's part of this room where they're still uncovering them and working on them. And then there's other sections at this archaeological site. So there are different rooms that might have been different levels of officers. So there's a, you know, a smaller room I'm showing that has these, you know, really deep cut walls, much smaller in size than the large pit that I just showed you in the other room. And there would have been more like generals and horses and archers and different figures inside of here. And so on the right, you can kind of see what the pieces would have looked like as they were being uncovered. And so many of them were smashed, either from the earth caving in, like those wooden beams caving in over time, maybe there were earthen mounds over them, or perhaps also some of them were discovered, and people who were unhappy with this emperor might have smashed them, gone in and broken them. Even in after he passed away, his son continued to work on this for at least a year, if not more. And then after that, China would have split back up. And so it was only temporary what was going on with this guy. And so there was a few people who were upset with him and went in and smashed them as much as they could, smash the faces and things like that. So you can imagine it's a giant puzzle putting this thing back together. So this is one of the only archer figures that was found fully intact. So most of them are broken. So the whole figure is clay. You can tell what rank they are by what kind of clothing they're wearing, what kind of shoes, what manner their hair is in. And then they would have all had weapons. So he would have had a bow in his hand as a kneeling archer. And you can see on his back just a little bit of the red, still the paint that still exists on his body armor. So these would have been other figures, whether or not they, you know, might be a general or some kind of commander or officer. And the final one is a man in sort of an active pose. And so he would have been more like an infantryman. You can see that he's not wearing any armor at all. He has cloth, he has fabric clothes, and you can see the position of his body. He would have originally had a weapon in his hand that probably deteriorated. But so imagine each one of these parts, the hands, the head, the torsos, the abdomen region and the feet, all of those things would have been mold made and assembled together. And they do, some of these travel all over the world. And so you can see them at different museums. Just a couple fun things to show you with that. I worked with a man from Switzerland who made these tiny molds, and he was really interested in those faces from the terracotta warriors. And so he would manipulate each one of these tiny little molds, and he made thousands of them to hang on the wall. While I was visiting Xi'an, I got to visit a small factory that's still allowed to use some of the clay from the mountain that the original terracotta warriors would have been made from. And so this is a teeny tiny little mold that made tiny little terracotta warriors. You could take one home. And that's what this woman was doing all day long, was pressing clay into the mold and popping out these tiny little warriors. I have a video clip of it. Let's see. I don't know if your video will catch up with this, and you can see her pressing it in.
So we fought these.
So she's pressing into both sides of the mold, plastic clay, filling in all the corners just like we did for our tile molds. And then she will seal those two molds together. She's kind of pushing up the clay around the edge so that there's something above the surface of the mold to kind of attach when she pushes them together. So filling it in at the bottom and then probably letting it sit off to the side so that it can dry out a little bit. And then she's going to pop out one that she had made earlier. And then as that rests, you're kind of cleaning off all of the side parts of the mold. So she'll come along later with a knife and scrape all of those edges. So mold assisted sculpture. This is our last stop in China before we head back to the Western world. Does anybody have any questions about the terracotta warriors before I move on? I can see your chats today, so this time I can answer them, or you're also welcome to turn your volume on and ask them. So from Xi'an, we will travel to Germany. So this is from a trip that I took students to Berlin. We also went to Copenhagen, and I won't show any pots from there, but we ended in the Netherlands. So I wanted to show two things. One is this, the KPM manufacturer. It's a porcelain manufacturer in Berlin. And I just wanted to show a little bit about its work. So I'm trying to think, well into the 1800s, probably earlier, this company was started. The work is fairly Baroque when the company starts. So a lot of what they're doing is this really fancy china for dinnerware, for upper class people. You can see a lot of gold luster, and there's a lot of painting, and it's very like romantic and fanciful. They also did a lot of sculptures, and I thought this sculpture was interesting. It's of two women walking, and it's a porcelain sculpture, and if you look at the detail on their clothing, all the fabric and the drapery, it's really quite amazing. And on the right side, I hope that you can see all of the different pieces that actually go together to make this piece. So each individual clay piece you see there is a separate mold. Those things are all molded individually, and then they're joined together just the way that we're joining our pots together with slip and with knives and cleaning up the seams. So when you think about like how complicated that is, that's not coming out of a one-part mold or a multi-part mold. It is it's pieced out of many, many molds and then has to be assembled together. So this company is still surviving, and they go on to make some pretty interesting modern dinnerware and some really well-known potters from the Bauhaus made ceramic work for this company in the middle of the 20th century, which is one of the reasons I'm familiar with them. Gerhard Marx and Marguerite Friedlander, which is her name when she was still in Germany, but eventually comes Marguerite Wildenhain, and lives in California in Pond Farm and teaches in the United States. So they are designers that were producing really interesting work in the middle of the 20th century, and it's all mold made at this KPM in Berlin. So there was a history section here, and there was also a fabrication section. This is, maybe you can see like a pour over coffee maker. They also did some interesting collaborative projects with car manufacturers. Bugatti in particular designed a car with KPM porcelain integrated into the body parts of the car itself. So you can only imagine how many hundreds of thousands of dollars this Bugatti would cost. It's a little bit excessive, but they had some really beautiful work. One or two of the pieces I saw had some really interesting form work. There's like a flower planter here that's showing like a double, it's cut, it's showing a double wall section, so it's hollow on the inside. They made some tremendously fancy dinnerware, and so they had a really amazing like exhibit of like a dining room and what all of these fancy place settings might look like. It was really kind of over the top, some of the sculptures that they had inside of their facility, whether or not they turned into chandeliers or they were still life. You know, a lot of it seemed kind of fantasy to me, like there's teapots hiding in the flowers in the garden, or little teacups or casserole dishes, wherever they are. It's it was very unusual. Some really bizarre sculptures of cracked pieces and debris from their factory. And the factory was actually pretty hard to get into. So we got to see the outskirts of it, but actually getting into the facility was pretty challenging. But they had a nice exhibit of the different materials for their clay bodies. And they had a lot of exhibits about how their molds were made, how the different forms that they were using over time and how that changed. So you might see development of handle shapes, or you might see materials that were made to actually cast the molds from. So some of those materials are plastic or plaster. A lot of their molds have maybe decorative texture. I think someone was asking me about that in the last class or two. Like, could you cast texture into the surface of a pot? And so some of them you can definitely see have really fancy, almost like wedgewood sprigs on the outside of them, like drapery or fabric would line a window. But the molds are beautiful. I can't stress enough, especially as I demo mold making today, how important it is to really think through a mold. The piece that you make from any mold is only going to be as good as the setup for the mold itself. The rougher the edges, the rougher the part line, it just dramatically increases the amount of work you have to do to make the piece and to have it look nice every single time. So they did have some small sections where we could walk around and you could see the details of their molds. A lot of the molds they would use might be press molds. So if you see any molds that look like there's an inside and an outside, a lot of times what will happen is, you know, with a press mold, you're using a plastic piece of clay and with a hydraulic press, pressing the two sides together, and then that shapes the piece, and it can be trimmed around the outside. So when you look at a bowl mold, you could probably see, especially on that interior piece, a little edge of plaster that looks like it's offset from the bowl itself, and that's actually the cut edge of the plaster that's going to push up against the other side of the mold and separate off the excess, and then you can just clean the edge. So again, they have handles getting pressed right into the shape, and then when you look at the actual finished piece, maybe you can see where they've done some secondary piercing. So if you ever want to have like holes going through a cast piece, usually that has to happen outside of the mold. Trying to cut an interior hole inside of a mold piece like that, the clay will kind of grab around it by the time it's dry enough to come out of the mold, it won't let go of that little plug. So you can see one piece here, maybe that is, the edges are kind of rough, and then you can see a finished piece that has some piercings in it. That was probably hand done. We couldn't get close enough to the kilns to see much about their firing process, but they had some fun displays, what it might look like to stack a kiln with the pots that they make, and then what those pots might have looked like when they come out of the glazed kiln. So most all of their work would be white porcelain and then fired with a clear glaze, and then using some kind of overglaze to paint on top of them. And so an overglaze is a material that is like a colored glass, and so it holds its color really well. And then you can paint on the surface almost like watercolor. And then when you fire it, you don't fire it as hot as the glaze needs to go. You only fire it just hot enough to get the glaze a little bit soft, and then have that overpainting melt, and then it kind of melts into the surface. And so that's a special talent, I think, painting, this porcelain painting. It was one of the first jobs that women were really widely accepted in. If you think about the Industrial Revolution, the painting of pottery is well known for employing women long before other professions would. So one of the things that you would have to be an expert at to paint on these surfaces would be brush strokes and color matching. So if you can imagine you're painting a set after set after set, if there's any variation in tone, then those things aren't sellable as even a finely produced, mass-produced object. You would have to take pretty good care of how you're applying those materials. So it's kind of fun. We did get to do a little workshop inside of their facility where the students got to paint on the surface and bring those home and have them be permanent. So that was kind of fun. Before we leave Berlin, I just wanted to show you a few pieces from the Arts and Crafts Museum there. These are, it came up because I was taking some photographs of Marguerite Wildenheim's work. You can see maybe me and Paul in that's my self-portrait for Berlin. I have some of these pots in my office. So again, I really wish we were at school. You could hold some really beautiful pots. Just let me know if you have questions about anything that you saw in the Berlin factory or the pots that I'm showing now. Most of these were created at the end of the 1800s up until, probably the 60s, the 1960s, heavy on the Art Nouveau period. So this particular museum not only had really beautiful ceramics, it had wonderful metalworking, and it had beautiful Art Nouveau furniture. Just beautiful woodworking and glassworking. I always like to pick out at least one or two museums in every new city I visit, and it's so worth it to be in the same space as some of these really finely crafted objects. It just reminds you so much of the human spirit, and it reminds you so much of how much we've changed over time, what's important and what we value. So it has some beautiful furniture, and it had a lot of other different types of art. There was some jewelry and some graphic design, which was really quite lovely to enjoy and to kind of see these different art forms together and to see how the shapes overlap. So, whether or not it's these flow forms, playing off the human body, or the body mixed with, man-made objects or nature. It's just really lovely. So most of the ceramics I'll show the next few slides are just ceramics from this museum. A lot of what I'm looking at, especially with these forms from the Art Nouveau, is the relationship of attachments to the main bodies of these vessels. So the handles and lids, and we've been talking a lot about teapots the last couple of classes, and tea bowls and cups and things like that. And so I'm just kind of interested in their proportions, and I just want to soak it all in. I want to see if I can see some connection between the curvatures and handles, or if I can see some connection, especially with like surface decoration. So a lot of this work from the Art Nouveau is really floral, or has like bugs or insects or something on it. And the way that they grow out of these really organic forms and these really soft, curvy handles of the ceramics, I just think really, really beautiful. And some of them are really highly painted, and some of them are not. Some of them have really subtle glazes, maybe matte or crystalline. And so that like non-glossy surface, maybe you see a little bit different light and dark. The shadows as the light falls across the piece can sometimes be different on some of these matte forms, or things that have these really intricate curves. So there's a couple teapots that show up here in coffee pots and sugar and creamer that have this really fun play between surface decoration and handles and spouts. So maybe there's something that aligns the forms together, and you can see almost the extension of that negative space onto the body of the pot as it kind of reaches in. So Bobby was asking in the chat, what was the form that it's the bowl with the 3 handles that led to the lower level? You know, something like that I bet was like a candy dish or a server of some kind. And so little fancy things would be separated. So you can imagine little coated nuts or little candies, things like that, I would think would be served in there. So some of this decoration that you might see on the pots is also maybe decals. So some things are hand painted, and just like I have been screen printing on my pots, that's something that's, you know, that idea of like transferring images has been around for a long time. And so some of them are pretty highly decorative, and these might have been decals that are, you know, printed on a film that burns away. So you print glaze material, actually using the screen print, right? And then you sort of seal it on there, almost with like an enamel. So one side of it can't dissolve in water right away, one side does, and then you transfer it onto the surface, and then they're fired together. So if they look really geometric, that is probably what is going on. But just a few modern pots. Simplicity of form is something that I want you to talk about or think about if you want to design your own piece. Some of these are quite complicated and have multiple parts to them. So at the end of this talk, I'll talk about how to really design a one-piece mold as opposed to a two-piece mold, and what would be a good thing for you to try in your own space if you had access to some plaster of Paris. So I'm just going to finish on a tiny little set with orange bubbles, and bubbles in the handles and bubbles in the lids. So looking across that set of all the different form languages that, you know, that are elements that kind of pull that together. So we're going to say thank you, Berlin and Royal Berlin Porcelain Factory, and then we're going to hop over to the Netherlands. So let me know if you have any questions about what you just saw. But I wanted to go to Delft, which is south of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I thought that this would be an interesting place to travel to, because we talked about Jingdezhen, which is known for its blue and white porcelain. And if you remember, I told you that porcelain in that region was special for a very, very long time. Other people in the world could not find deposits of porcelain, weren't really sure how it was processed. Some of those secrets were guarded very well. And then people in Europe started mimicking it. So they liked it so much, they would take their clay from their region, and then maybe they would paint it white with like a tin glaze, and then they would paint blue over it. And that's a lot of like the Malica ware that comes out of Italy is this white, and then it's very colorfully painted. And that all stems from an influx of Chinese porcelain into Europe along the Silk Road and through the whole tea trade and things like that. And so many companies all throughout Europe wanted to mimic this, and eventually they did find their own pure kaolin deposits to make really white clay. And so it's really common to find, especially in Northern Europe, this blue and white ware, and it's all meant to come from, to look like it's as special as Chinese porcelain. But of course, most companies also do a lot of architectural ceramics. So not just making pottery or large vessels, they're also making like tiles. So here you can see some examples of old tiles that blue and white painted, and that would have come from the Delft factory for sure. So they had a nice exhibit where you could really see some of their old molds, and there you can see some multi-part molds that are maybe held together with straps, or plate molds, large vessels. So it was fun to tour this factory and see forms that were special to the Netherlands. They would make things, especially for flowers and tulips. So if you see vessels that have multiple spouts on the top, those are tulip pots. So you can hold multiple of these flowers with these heavy heads, but all gathered together in one vessel. Inside of this factory, we did actually get to go inside of, and they had a few places where you could see what was going on with the pots. And so they might show what the molds look like, and then the vessels in the different stages. So maybe one that's dry and one that's been bisque fired. And when you paint this pottery, the cobalt color, it looks black when you paint it on, and only after it goes in and out of the kiln do the other materials burn out, and all that's left is the cobalt on the surface to give it that brilliant blue. But they had maybe, I don't know, 15 employees working inside of this factory making their pots. They had a lot of slip casting. So there was some pressware, but you can see racks and racks of molds. So whenever you have a place that's like in a production pottery, they're going to make their positive, like I'm going to make for you today. I'll show you a little bit about how to do that. And then they make one mold, and then from that mold, they make a master positive. And then that positive makes all of the other molds. So they have like an original set that stays clean, and then they kind of go back and forth just a little bit, making a block mold and then a master positive, and then making all the molds from that. So they're all the exact same. Yeah, it's always fun to see how people make pottery. They did offer classes here, which was kind of fun. And so in a minute, I'll show you us making some pots. They had a pretty nice variety of forms. So I don't know that it was a high volume place like Homer Lachlan, which we can visit maybe next week or something, that's in West Virginia, that makes fiesta ware and a lot of like tableware for restaurants and stuff. So these were kind of low production runs, and you can tell by the way that they're stacked, because normally potters will stack similar pots together to kind of be efficient inside of the kiln. But the work was really beautiful. And they had a few people that were hand painting. And so you could imagine how skilled you must be with a brush to paint these intricate patterns over and over again. And a lot of people who work in this industry work up through apprenticeships. So the first job that you get in one of these factories is not hand painting. In fact, I would bet most of the people who paint in these factories have pretty significant art degrees to be able to show the skill they have. But otherwise, you're pushing a broom or you're mixing clay. It's going to be a long time before you're doing fine handwork. So I think these are a couple of the pieces that we got to paint, and they went on the glazing shelf. So this was super fun. We got to sit right outside the factory and have a woman from the factory help us learn how to use the materials. And they had really special brushes. If you look at the paint brushes, they would actually trim the bristles. So these weren't things that they could order. So some of you might be starting to play around in watercolors, or maybe you enjoy painting as a medium. So each brush has a particular shape that you can achieve, and it holds a particular amount of material. And so they would trim the ends of these brushes to get just a certain shape of line. And you can see in one of them, they've trimmed off almost all of the bristles. It's almost as fine as that brush I showed you from Ecuador that was hair. It was like human hair. They would tie together, 15 strands of hair, and then that would be the brush for these like incredibly delicate lines. So we got to draw on the pots and paint with them. It was very fun. And Blythe, you get to tell Connor that you saw a picture of him when he was a freshman. Here's all the little pictures that we painted. And they fired these and sent them back to us, and they're the most beautiful blue. And if you visit my office, you can see the one that I painted that looks like the city of Amsterdam. It was pretty nice. All right, and we're about to end our trip through Delft, exiting through the gift shop. And just wanted to remind you with this silly dress that's made of blue and white ware bags, that particular type of pottery coming out of Jingzhen has inspired thousands of products over the year, So it's all across the world, yeah. So are there any questions about pottery made in Delft, or any of the molds that you saw before I switch over to doing a little bit of a demo this morning? Are we doing okay? How are we doing out there? I'll give you a minute to respond. I know it takes a second to type, but I am about ready to go on to show you just a few more slides about process. So we're switching gears to process. When we started this semester, we all made one-piece molds of tiles. You remember they were solid. So we made a solid tile ourselves, and then we built a box around it, and then we cast it in plaster. So this is kind of like that, the tile that you see. And then this is a wooden box built around it, and we did cardboard boxes. And so it would be reusable, and I can explain it again, but the way that these clamps work, I can actually slide this like a pinwheel and make it larger if necessary. As far as like one-piece molds, things that would be easy for you to try is some people like to do molds where they maybe make them out of clay themselves. So these little roller stamps are a really good way to get texture. I know we've been talking a lot about texture, so I just wanted to show this. And this is also a solid mold. This seahorse is called a sprig. And so a sprig is a shape that you could make out of raw clay and then just pour a little bit of teeny tiny bit of plaster on it. So it's kind of like a thin sculpture, like a bas relief. And then when that plaster dries and you pull out that original piece, then you have the negative space of that shape, and you can rub clay into it. So it's like this really thin sheet, but it gets that texture or that shape. and you kind of clean off the edges. And if you quickly dip that in water, you can put it on the outside of a pot and kind of press it in. It's called a sprig, and it can decorate the surface of your pot. So I just wanted to show you one other little fun solid clay molding process. This is an example of a couple more on the left. You know, they're Celtic signs or little letters. And then I had a mug that's really highly decorated. And if you can see on the surface, it has little plants and frogs and stuff like that. Those are those sprigs kind of put onto the surface of a vessel. And that was made by a woman in Texas named Lisa Orr. And she was very unusual. She actually did a lot of throwing in molds. So she would make molds out of clay, and then she would attach them to the surface of the wheel, and then she would throw in them. And what would happen is that the shape of that mold would like pre-cast a foot for her. So it would already have like a hump on the inside, and she would be pressing clay down into the foot, whatever would be touching the table. And then it would automatically have this kind of curve and cantilever, and then she would continue to throw above that. So like the little teapot that you might see her with there, that shape of that teapot, the flare at the bottom and the little of the lift and that goes into the body, that was actually thrown inside of a mold. So remember, we've talked about molds in a couple of different ways. But what I want to think about today is how we might make a one-piece mold for a vessel. So a really good place to start with a one-piece mold like that is a bowl or something that's this cone-like, so that you know that it's going to be easy to pull out of the mold. When we did our tile molds, we talked about undercuts and about straight-sided walls. We talked about positives that were rigid as opposed to flexible. All of those things are important to think about when you're deciding what it is you want to cast. And so we're really looking at something that we can kind of build upside down. So we see that cone shape. We're going to put plaster on top of it. And then when we flip it over, that widest part of that cone is where we pour the clay in and out, where we pull the piece in and out of the mold. So if you guys want to think about trying this at home, there's a couple of different things that you can do. One of them is find an object that you would like to cast. So I have here a mold that is being made off of an already fired bowl. So if you have something that you like, or perhaps can find easily, then you can cast off of it if it doesn't have any sort of undercuts, or if it's not a two-piece mold. You can make two-piece molds off of found objects. I just think for the first one, it'd be easiest to make a one-piece mold. The important thing about the found object is that it cannot be precious to you. Sometimes things go wrong. And when plaster goes wrong, it's called a plaster disaster, because it goes really wrong really quickly. And if this piece is precious to you, like I would not cast my grandmother's favorite china cup because I wanted to recreate it. I would 3D print that cup, and then I would cast from the 3D print, because it might get stuck, or the plaster might stick to it, or maybe you might have to, maybe you misread the form a little bit. It has to break to actually come out of the plaster. So that is something to think about. If you do cast at home and you're thinking like, what are the supplies that I can get? Somebody's asking about the mold soap. So like, yeah, in the studio, a lot of times we'll use the Murphy's oil soap as a mold release. But you can use vegetable oil, super easy, or remember Vaseline. And so if the object is not porous, like it's metal or ceramic or glass, the plaster won't chemically bind to it like it would bind to like wood, like unfinished wood or anything like that. But I would still use vegetable oil. It will work just fine. If you do want to order materials, High Water Clays is open. I talked to them yesterday about an order, so the Asheville office is open. You can order supplies if you would like to. Okay, so I showed you a picture of a found object, and now I want to show you a few images of other ways that people make positives. And the most traditional way is out of plaster. So this is actually a solid block of plaster that's being turned on a wood lathe to trim away to the material. Traditionally, also, plaster shapes are made on a wheel, like a potter's wheel. And so you might have a small chuck on the top of a wheel. This wheel actually has like a plaster disc on the top and then a chuck on top of that. And then you build a coddle, which remember is the boards that hold the liquid plaster. You build a coddle on top of that and pour liquid plaster in. And when it's set up just enough to be like Jell-O, so it's not hard, but it's firm, you know, it's holding together more than whipped cream, then you can take that, that mold board off and then scrape it with a profile to get it down to the shape. And then as it stiffens, scrape it even more with metal tools. And so this was an interesting workshop I took at Penland down in North Carolina. And this was during my graduate thesis. And so I was trying to make a plaster model that was smooth enough to cast and plaster for my thesis set. So I was looking at the difference in the way that people design pots in the dinnerware industry, and 3D prints, as some of you know, are challenging to cast off of because the surface is so messy. But these plaster models can be quite smooth because you can sand them, very smooth. And so this is actually one of the pieces I made for my thesis set. So this would have been a plaster plate that would be suitable for casting because it was at the proper dimensions. And then I also made the thesis set, which had this kind of cantilever and wide rim. I also made it in a square version. And so I have a couple of images here of how that piece was made, which is the idea that you would have a base shape outlined and then a profile to scrape along the form is exactly what I'll do today to make a positive out of clay. So I'm pre-planning the geometry, but this guy I made an interior mold that was like a pyramid, and then I cast more plaster on top of it, but made it separate. So then I had that interior pyramid and the exterior pyramid that I shaved with my little form, and then cast separately around the edge the rim of the bowl so that it would have a nice wide rim. And so again, I'm trying to make a model that's at the proper section in a material that's robust enough that it could also be cast out of. And so this is an image of that asymmetrical square bowl with the wide rim. It's probably in my office. Yeah. So as we're talking about what you might be able to do in class, I wanted to point you towards a book by Andrew Martin, which you can find in the library or online. He is a potter who actually is working out of the Netherlands as well. He's an American, but he lives in the Netherlands. And this is a great book for getting into how to make molds. His work is pretty interesting. It's very, it has a lot of shape to it. His forms are not things that you could get off of the wheel. And so I want to show you a little bit about how he gets these irregular shapes. And that'd be one of the reasons I would slip cast. So if it's something specifically that I can't make on the wheel, slip casting becomes the right method. So he would take, you know, when you were looking at that edge form, a lot of his pots were conceived sort of in the plan view. So you might see a rim defined and a foot defined. And this is what I'm going to do today as well. And so he would cut these shapes out, trying to kind of explore different curves and relationships. And then he would cut that shape out of a more rigid material like masonite. So maybe with a jigsaw, cutting its shape. And the one that I'm going to do today, you'll see that the shapes are really similar. So when I'm talking about the shape of the rim and the shape of the foot, they're really similar, but maybe they change in scale. That's a really common way to kind of build a form. So some of his shapes would actually change, and some of them were a change in scale. So he could get these sort of lobes or sort of curves or ribbons like around the side. And so what would happen is you separate that base plate and the top plate with a form and pack it with clay in between. And I have one for you, I'll show here in just a second. And he used a big cheese cutter to kind of go around the edge so that you are using the edge of that rigid form that he cut as a guide to shape the clay. So what you're trying to do is make a pattern for the top and the bottom of the bowl that's rigid enough to hold up to tools so that you can use tools to scrape and sculpt the surface of the raw clay that you want to cast in plaster. The reason raw clay is nice is because it's easy to smooth, it's easy to patch if you accidentally take a chunk out. It also doesn't chemically bind to the plaster, so it's really easy to get out of the mold. So here you're looking down inside of his coddle, made with some aluminum flashing, and I have some here I'll show you. And so what you're looking at is his bowl upside down. So you're looking at the foot of his bowl, and then you can see that sculpted clay all around that form, and it reaches down to that bottom rim that he also cut out of masonite. And so when that's inside of the mold and sealed down and the edges of the coddle are sealed down, just like we did for our tile molds, you can pour the plaster in to the top of it. So that way you have a hole at the rim of your bowl, and that plaster covers the base and the foot. So the slipcast is going to take that form. I think that's a little pixelated. I just wanted to show you the scale that he worked at can be really quite large. And that's a one-piece mold, so it's popping right outside of that form. And the reason you can see through to his shirt is so that the mold is not so heavy when you pick it up. He has that like attached to another like plaster slab that kind of separates when you lift that big piece up. But I think I was saying that, yeah, it's just easier to use the clay to make these positives. They come out of the mold really easily, and they can be really easily sculpted by hand with a little bit of patience. Last funky thing that Andrew did that I wanted to show you was, I know some of you have been interested in colored clay, and so he would take two different colored slips and then mix them together inside of a container in a way that they would drip out at different rates, and then get these wacky like marbled slabs. So he'd use the liquid to make the pattern almost, yeah, like you could swipe your fingers around into it, and then the way it dripped, it also leaked. And then those would stiffen up enough that he could use them like a drape mold. And so he would peel those slip sheets up, excuse me, and lay them over a mold, or lay them inside of a mold, or even like rip them and lay them inside of a slip mold and then pour slip on top of them to kind of seal them into place. So it wasn't like a full sheet, but there was like little sections of it. And then that liquid slip would kind of hold it, and then you would dump all the rest out. So just some interesting things with the slip that might be fun to try. So Bobby's asking a little bit about what kind of plaster. If you were to order plaster from Highwater, I get Pottery plaster #1. You can, for the amount of molds that you're going to make, just use plaster of Paris, but there are no other plasters at the hardware stores, at least not in the greater Blacksburg-Christiansburg area, that I would recommend, because they do not cast at thick section. They stay damp. They never get totally dry. So pottery plaster number 1 if you're going with high water, or pottery plaster of Paris if you have to go to the hardware store. So I showed you just a little bit the one-piece mold. So I just want to show you a little bit about the complexities of a 2-piece mold, just in case anybody's getting a little bit excited. This is actually looking down probably at the bottom of a piggy bank. So half the piggy bank is buried in clay and its little feet are sticking up. So I just wanted to show you about how a 2-piece mold would be built, because you have to make it in sections. And so the first thing is whatever you're going to mold, you have to bury halfway in clay. And you have to find that part line exactly, because whatever you bury in clay determines where the mold is split. So however smooth you do that, however smooth the surface is, however precisely you're on the halfway mark, determines whether or not you can get your piece out of the plaster in the end. And so this is actually going to be like the idea of making a banana. You know, people like to cast fruit, whatever. So this is like a banana in a mold. It's buried halfway in the clay and they're pouring plaster on top of it. So a banana wouldn't be a big deal. It's squishy, you can rip that thing out. But if you're trying to cast something like a block of wood or a 3D print, you have to be able to get it in and out of the mold. So what happens when you pour the plaster on the top is you take the box apart when it's stiff and you flip the whole thing over and you remove all the excess clay, and then your banana is in half a block of plaster. Yeah. And then you have to cut some keyholes in it. So whenever you have a 2-piece mold, there's some sort of keyholes that lock the pieces together. And then you can pour the other half. So I put that box back in the back around the first half of the plaster, and then put mold release between them and pour the second half so that those keyholes line up perfectly. And here you can see they have a little sprue hole for where the banana is. So that's a place where the clay can easily go in and out, but then that gets trimmed off later. So when it stiffens up, you can pop those 2 molds apart, and then you are ready to go. And we usually do clean off the sides of the mold so they're not really sharp. You might remember that from the tile mold. So the edges are kind of smooth, and then that makes it less likely to chip and break while it's in the studio. So those are just the kind of a couple images, because I know sometimes my video lags when I do the demonstrations. So I just wanted to show you a few of the setups for what it looks like to make a 1-piece mold and a 2-piece mold. So I'm going to stop my screen share for a minute and switch over to the demo section. So do you guys have any questions about what I showed before I show you what I have here for just the last few minutes of class? Let me set up my camera so you can see a little bit better, sorry. Okay, I'll take that as a no. So I wanted to make a 1-piece mold for you today. I wanted to show you a couple things. So remember, I'm encouraging you to do something simple. This is actually one of my empty bowls. So you can see what I mean by it has just a gentle cone shape. And if there's time, I have one here I can pull out of the mold for you. I wanted to show you what it might look like to have a found object. So this is a like a glass light fixture. Went over an old ceiling fan or something that we had that has this really interesting striped texture on it. So I think that this might be something that I could cast. So I like the outside texture, and when I cast the plaster on it, that's what I'll get. But on the inside, when I pour the clay in it, it will definitely be smoother. And so it could have a really nice interior. So one of the hardest things about this is that it has a ruffled edge. So whatever found object you have to seal it down to the table like you would the tile that we did in the beginning of the semester. And so I have some cut mats that I collect at the end of every year because people abandon them. And they're perfect for making molds on because they're plastic and you can clean the plaster right off in them and you never notice it. But what I would do is actually take clay, and I would have to fill in the entire sides of this. It also has a hole in the top, and I would want to patch that. So I don't want any plaster to slide around this. So I would build a footprint for this piece all the way around. And because it has a scalloped edge, there's a couple decisions I would have to make about that. Where do I end the pot? So do I actually build a clay shelf so the top of my mold is flat, but it's above where this ripple is? Or do I fill in this space and then try and smooth out down to the surface so I can see a little bit of the ripple, but it actually has a really nice clean edge, and then the surface of the table is making the flat part of the mold. So just like in the way that the tile mold had to have a flat surface for us to run the stick across to clean the back of the mold, all of your one-piece molds have to have a flat surface on the top that's level, because you pour the liquid in and that liquid goes up the edge. And if it's not level, then the slip is going to come out somewhere. So I have to figure out how to make this thing with a ruffled edge have a flat edge. So I can either make a false floor to cover it totally, or I can fill in the negative space and use the table to make that surface of the mold. I like the glass because it doesn't collapse and it doesn't stick to the plaster. There's some little tiny nooks and crannies around this rim, which that would have been attached to the ceiling fan. But I think there's a chance that it's so tiny in there that plaster could get stuck. So it's not uncommon, especially if you have to deal with the foot of an object, like you're making something that's not meant to be a foot. I'm actually going to fill this whole place with clay. I may even make a whole clay patty for the top so that I can completely define what that foot looks like. And then I might go in and fill any tiny negative space that I think plaster is going to get trapped really easily. I'm going to go ahead and fill that with clay. If you do it with plasticine, you can do it at any time and come back a day or two later and still cast your piece, because plasticine doesn't dry out and it doesn't change shape. But if you put raw clay on this piece, then you have to cast right away, or else it will start to dry and crack off. And then by the time that you pour plaster on it, all of that clay breaks away and it just becomes a big mess. So you have to kind of be thoughtful about how much time you're taking whenever you make a mold and whenever you use raw clay. Now so that's a found object. Another way to get something in your home that would be easy to cast, a one-piece mold, is I've made a triangle bowl. I was looking at my empty bowl, and it's one of the only, I have round, I have square, I have 5 sides, I have 6 sides, but I have 2 sides, but I don't have 3 sides. So I'm making a new one. And so I drew out my geometry because I want it to be really precise. Remember, it's super important to me. So I'm planning out what that rim and foot look like. And then I cut that out of really stiff chipboard. You could also laser cut this if you had access to that, or mill it, use the bandsaw, whatever you want. I don't get material that's super thick because I always think about the edge of it, but the chipboard is fine because I can cut that at home with an X-Acto knife. Chipboard will warp a little bit with water. Just doing a quick time check. Will warp a little bit with water, and so when I put it together, I usually cover it with packing tape. So you might not be able to tell, but this is a little bit shiny because after I cut the top and the bottom, my 2 shapes, I hot glued them together with a post in the middle, and then I've covered the whole thing with packing tape. And I like the packing tape because it seals the chipboard without having to like paint it with polyurethane, which would make it wrinkle, right? Getting it wet like that. And it doesn't stick to the plaster either. So it comes out of a plaster mold really easily. So the board doesn't warp because you kind of sealed it. And so it's pretty easy just to take the packing tape and cover pretty much every corner, with the only caveat being you don't want it to wrinkle. So if you get like a weird fold over a corner, that's just trim it off with your scissors, because every single little wrinkle and fold is going to show up in the plaster. You're going to have to do a lot of cleaning up to that plaster mold anyway, but it's nice to kind of start with a smooth surface. When I'm getting ready to put this together, I'm probably going to build on a non-porous surface so that I can maybe just cast right on it. And then I'm going to use this raw clay and pack it all around the form. At first, it's just kind of loose, trying to fill in the negative space. And then once I get it on, and I'll try and get to one side for you, then I'm going to use my regular sculpting tools and clean up the surface. So if we were in the regular studio, I would prefer for you to use reclaimed clay to do this, because whatever clay you use with the plaster mold is not easily reclaimed. And it can take a fair amount of clay. If some people, you can build these forms up, like out of sheet materials. Maybe I wanted to build the surface in some way. Maybe I could vacuum form some different pieces and glue them together. You just want to make sure about two things. One, that it doesn't float. So if you remember, some of our tile molds floated. Wood and 3D prints float. Raw clay does not. Or you don't want it to collapse. So if it's hollow on the inside, it might collapse a little bit, and then you know, it's not working at all. Okay, so I'm sculpting this on the surface. I have one side kind of filled in, and it's pretty lumpy right now, but that's okay. I'm going to use some sort of template. So right now, I just kind of want sort of a clean surface. So I'm just using it's totally see-through, so you can't even see it, but it's just like a ruler. And I'm going to scrape along the surface here. And the reason I'm doing this is because the chipboard on its edges are keeping me from scraping down past the form I want. So I know if I have a little negative space, I'm just going to patch it with more clay. And then I'm going to use my ruler like a rib, kind of smooth things out, and then scrape along the surface. And then I'll do that around all three sides, with the most detail happening right at the corners. So once I get all of the surfaces cleaned up, kind of really pulling that edge and making sure it's clean is probably the most time consuming. So things that you could try at home: a found object or making a clay positive. When you get your positive, much like the tile mold, we have to build a form around it. And I'm going to try a couple new things. I normally use, and what we have in the studio is aluminum flashing. And right now it's just kind of safety pinned together so it doesn't pop open. But the aluminum flashing is something that well, I'll open it just a little bit. Because it's a big sheet, I can change the diameter by pulling it a little bit tighter. And so this makes a nice round mold. That way, when I'm, molding my piece, if I make it square but my piece is round, then I'm using like a lot of excess plaster. So this is a way to make it a different sizes, and to seal it up, I would run duct tape along the seam on the inside or the outside. And as I'm sealing it to the table, remember for our tile molds, some of us used a little bit of duct tape around the outside. And then for these, a lot of times I'll take clay and make a large coil to go around my piece, so that when this metal goes over the top, I can split that coil, and there's clay on the inside and the outside of the metal. And if I blend it in all the way around, then the plaster can't slide out from underneath this piece. And that's the most important part, is controlling the plaster. So that's kind of an overview today. I know we're at the end of class time, so I'm going to stick around and see if there are any questions. We'll have a guest on Thursday. I wanted to give you an idea about what this looked like in enough time so that if you wanted to make something next week, you would have time to get a few materials and test some things out, and then we could talk about them again in class. So I'm going to pause for a second and see if there are any questions. I'd be happy to hear them, so you can type them or you can ask them. Somebody is asking a little bit about shipping. I think it really depends on how much you are going to order. I think if it's under 200 pounds, they UPS it, and over 200 pounds, they freight it. And I've had freight sent to my house. It depends on how much you want to order. I would call them on the phone as opposed to ordering online. Steve, the help desk guy, he really wants to help you. And they'll never tell you online an exact amount of shipping. That information always comes later. So I would call them instead of ordering online if you want to go with high water. Yeah. Are there any questions about making the one-piece mold? And as you're getting ready to head out, if you could please just leave me a reflection as normal in the group chat, that would be really helpful. And yep, Thursday we'll check back in, hopefully with my friend Stacy, and we'll talk a little bit about surface decoration, and then check back in with the mold making next week. I can't think of anything else today. I'll try and update the Canvas site with these last two recordings. And Evan, I think you're here today. Evan, stick around for a minute. I have another computer thing this afternoon during our normal independent study time I'd like to talk to you about. So I'm happy to answer questions. I'm just going to work on my little triangle pot here while you guys leave your reflections and say hi. Everybody have a good day. Oh, I forgot to show you my moon pots. Do you guys want to see them? All right, this is what happened to the plum blossom, and I put some auspicious clouds on it, and I think that worked. I like the plum blossom. That one worked. And then this weekend, I went for koi fish, and so it's harder to see, but these have the printing is actually like this tartan pattern, which I know is really weird, but that's okay because I'm weird. It's like this orange and white tartan pattern, which I thought would be cool with the koi fish. So those are two little koi fish chasing each other. So yay, moon pots. I have another one I'm making right now.